Thank you for tuning in to the Island Treasures podcast. We value the insights shared by our guests and host, but it's important to note that their personal experiences are intended to inform and encourage, and not to replace professional, legal, or medical advice. With that, we are ready for today's exciting episode. Hi there, I'm Alison Van Schie, host of the Island Treasures podcast for caregivers. And in this segment, I will be sharing some nuggets of wisdom, or shall I say treasures, from the Island Treasures treasure chest. Today we're revisiting an episode from Season 1 entitled Life Does Not End with a Diagnosis of Alzheimer's, which featured Dennis Dulniak. At the time we recorded the episode, Dennis was caregiving for his wife Nancy, who had early onset Alzheimer's. Sadly, Nancy passed away in 2021. And now Dennis continues to provide advocacy, support, and mentorship to others who have a loved one facing Alzheimer's. Take a listen to the following to hear Dennis's observations and suggestions from his experience as a caregiver. And we'll start with when Nancy received her diagnosis.
When we heard the diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, the doctor also indicated in his report that she has a disability and should no longer be working. And it was that shock that said, why did I not do this before she retired? Because people have long-term disability insurance plans, but yet both of us did not recognize the fact, nor had we heard that mild cognitive impairment or even Alzheimer's was a disability, just as it is a disease.
Getting the diagnosis and learning that Nancy's diagnosis meant that she had a disability and should no longer be working made them question why they hadn't gone for the diagnosis before she stopped working. From that point, they wanted to find ways to maintain optimal functioning for Nancy, and they found a brain fitness program, and they also participated in trials. Listen to what Dennis explains about their experience and the shocking statistic of early onset Alzheimer's, with his warning as it relates to getting insurance.
We kept working on how do we maintain a level of functionality for as long as we could. We went through a number of explorations and services that support Alzheimer's and dementia. And it was from that we learned that there was a brain fitness program that Nancy could enroll in. Wow. Which was kind of an adult daycare, but really a curriculum-based program designed to keep a person who was having cognitive issues with Alzheimer's and dementia as functional as possible, keep them stimulated. And so Nancy actually did participate in that for 4 years. But we also enrolled in a number of drug trial programs.
Okay.
And among the earlier programs, she received the PET scans, she received the spinal tap, confirming that she did in fact have early onset Alzheimer's at age 62. And so she was tested for the gene, the APOE4 gene, which could be indicative of a genetic carry through. And although the study did not want to share that information with us, I was able to get the information because it's important to us as well as our two boys, as well as to the sisters, that if in fact Nancy's carrying the gene, it may be important that they are potentially carrying the gene as well. And although it's not a definite, if you have the APOE4 gene, it certainly is a higher potential of having Alzheimer's. And now we're learning through some studies that the incidence of early onset Alzheimer's has increased 83% among people with young Alzheimer's who are between the ages of 30 and 65. And so Nancy was in that category, and we're seeing more of that. I highly recommend that anybody who may have that in the family make sure that they get their insurances checked out before that test comes in, because although this information should be protected, insurance companies seem to have a way of gaining access to such information, and it's possible that they may deny people with this gene, or their rates may suddenly escalate with this gene. And so long-term care insurance, life insurance policies should be reviewed before any gene testing is done on a person. And it's just one of those unfortunate, life-changing pieces of information that we need to deal with. And I've shared the information about getting tested before one quits a job or retires. And I've actually been able to save disability insurance on at least 2 people that I know of.
Dennis was able to retire from his career as a university registrar to spend time with Nancy after her diagnosis. And here's some of what they did together.
After the diagnosis, we did a lot of travel, and she loved to travel. And so going on cruises were just the next plan. And she would actually get engaged in the planning of that. And I would even ask her about some of the side activities, and she would frequently make a decision which one she would prefer to go on.
Nice. So the excursions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun. And from each of these cruises, I actually did a picture book once we got home. And the picture books were based upon my postings on Facebook, who I happen to have a large sector of friends who followed us vicariously, because I love to share the positives that we made after the diagnosis.
Dennis wanted to share the positives they were able to experience after the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And yet, he was experiencing the realities that accompany caregiving, including the slow loss of pieces of his loved one through Alzheimer's. Through these realities, Dennis learned how helpful support groups were, and he became a facilitator of a men's support group.
And so the difficulty I had as a caregiver had been in how do we overcome the frustration points? And I learned relatively early on that I was encountering what's called perpetual grief or ambiguous grief.
Yes.
It's the slow loss of an individual from this disease that you can't predict or prepare for. Because with each loss of her functionality, it was more responsibility that I, as a caregiver, had to assume. And it's through that very careful understanding that was very, very important. And that's why I love doing support groups at this point in facilitating them. I facilitate a men's group that I find very helpful, because frequently men are not willing to share and get involved. And so by bringing this group together, it's been helpful for me too. It's therapeutic, because I can share my current experiences, which are unfortunately way too rich in terms of actualization. But trying to deal with that and gain their support too has been helpful to me, because with this disease, caregivers can't be feeling like they're alone. And that is a frequent response, that they just don't know where to turn.
Yeah.
and the support group gives them that support that's so necessary.
Dennis recognizes that supports are also helpful for those who have the diagnosis, and he talks about a resource he has found to explain what Alzheimer's feels like from someone who has Alzheimer's.
We have to put ourselves in the shoes of the person with this disease to better help them feel like they have a support system too. I came across a book called Unmasking Alzheimer's, and it's written by a person in New York State who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she has actually created 32 masks and explains the decorations on the mask of what it feels like to have this disease. I found it exceptional on how descriptive she has been and touches upon so many facets of this disease. We wonder what is going on inside their head. And she has been able to actually put that in writing for us.
Wow.
Dennis shares more about how they went to couples support groups early on after Nancy's diagnosis, and then how important it was for him to keep up with his own activities. As Nancy participated in her brain fitness program, it not only provided her with stimulating cognitive activities, but it also provided Dennis with respite. Dennis also describes what his expanding support system looked like.
While Nancy was still in my house with me, we were part of couples support groups. I went to support groups on my own. She participated in her brain fitness that gave me respite.
Yeah.
Because as caregivers, we need to have our time as well. And although it's a 24/7 commitment for so many people who have their loved ones at home with them, you still need to have your own time. And so while she was still at home with me, I was still very active with the Lions, to where I still felt comfortable leaving her at home for short periods of time until I could no longer leave her at home for short periods of time. And so then my support system incorporated hiring companionship for her to come into the house and be with her and give her activities while I was away doing my other service work that was vitally important to me.
And yet there came the time when Dennis had to make a very difficult decision.
But it got to the point where the difficulty of her living at home with me became way too challenging and stressful. And the most difficult decision to be made was placing her into a memory care community. And I actually planned that out 7 months before actualizing that move without letting her know. Now, she had been at this facility because we've had support groups there. She actually participated in some of the activities there, so it was not foreign to her. And that decision that people need to make of placing their loved one is a very, very hard one. As I say, it was the hardest decision I had to make in our marriage. The life I had with Nancy was never going to be there again, and I had to take care of myself.
And taking care of himself is such an important point. He stresses how we need to pay attention to his words. And why is that, you may be asking? Here's Dennis's answer.
Because unfortunately, dementia is not going to end. It is going to increase, and we need to make the fact that the stigma of Alzheimer's and the myths about dementia need to be dispelled and openly discussed among families and friends so that people don't feel alone, that people have a support system, because life does not end with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And Nancy and I were living proof to that. We had a tremendously rich life for nearly 5 years after her diagnosis, before her being placed in memory care, and then life continued once she was in memory care.
And with that, I hope Dennis has helped you see that life can continue richly after the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. I invite you to listen to the full podcast episode called Life Does Not End with a Diagnosis of Alzheimer's to hear more from Dennis, including details of the dementia-friendly cruises he spoke about, as well as dementia-friendly dining. That concludes this Treasure Chest segment from the Island Treasures podcast for caregivers. Thank you for tuning in today. Take care.